first technical session, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Shashikala Gurpur, Director of Symbiosis Law School, Pune, Dean, Faculty of Law, Symbiosis International University, and former member of the Law Commission of India. Professor Shashikala Gurpur is a distinguished academician and orator, having presented more than 200 invited lectures, workshops, and seminars across India, Thailand, US, UK, Ireland, Germany, Australia, Canada, and UAE. She has an outstanding career with a wide range of experience in teaching, research, and industry, and has been continuing with Symbiosis Law School Pune since 2007. Dr. Gurpur received her PhD in international law from Mysore University, where she was the topper and gold medalist in LLM. Her career span includes long years of experience in legal literacy and gender training, where she served as the co-director in gender and human rights-based wing of an NGO for 2 years. She has also worked as HR manager and administration in an MNC in Abu Dhabi, UAE from 2004 to 2007. She has more than 24 years of experience in teaching, which includes 10 years in NLSIU Bangalore, SDM Law College, Mangalore, Manipal Institute of Communication, Manipal, and University College Cork, Ireland. Dr. Gurpur has been a member of the Law Commission of India. Currently, she is a part of the Curriculum Development Committee, Bar Council of India, and Academic Council of National Judicial Academy, Bhopal. She is on the advisory board and is a PhD referee to several national law schools and universities across India, including Jawaharlal Nehru University, NLS Jodhpur, Karnataka State Women's University, BPS Women's University, Goa University, and Saurashtra University, Gujarat. She is associated with academic and governing councils, research teams of several national law schools and universities, including IGNOU, NALSAD, NLSIU Bangalore, NLU Mumbai, NLU Nagpur, and is also a member of International Consortium of Law Schools. Recently, Dr. Shashikala Gurpur has been nominated as a member of the MCCIA Corporate Legislation Committee for the year 2002 to 2022 as well. She has been appointed as a distinguished member of the editorial board of the Cyber Law University International e-Journal. Dr. Gurpur has 65 articles, research papers, 2 co-authored books, and 12 book chapters to her credit. Dr. Gurpur has been listed in the book 100 Legal Luminaries of India by LexisNexis, along with Dr. N.R. Madhav Menon, Senior Counsel Indra Jaisingh, Advocate Arun Jaitley, Advocate Ram Jethmalani, and others. Her topic for this session will be online hate speech and the law, emerging trends and challenges. I now request you to kindly address the gathering, ma'am.
Thank you. Good morning, respected Professor Subramania, sir. Thank you for engaging me here. We really miss this February month's grand treat in CMR every year with the very standard presentations. I'm so happy to continue after a very inspiring and literary flair-filled address of Professor Venkat Rao, who is, like Professor Subramania, one of the excellent speakers. I'm also happy to come before you, unlike in our other interactions at CMR Forum on progressive and human rights oriented topics like the vulnerable or generic research methodology, to a very specific phenomenon of our times. Dear participants, you will have a wonderful address after me by our Professor Ashwini and a few more learned people who will be reflecting on different facets of research methodology coming from interdisciplinary orientation. Now, from my side, you will see now that I have dwelt on a topic which is very, very relevant and very, very contemporary, especially with the millennial generation, because today, and especially with the pandemic arresting us in our homes, yet our need to survive, our need to connect to the rest of the world, facilitated by the lifeline of information and communication technology. Now, aside from the dimensions of regulation of that, the what we call as the law is not in the vacuum, or the real life in which law is operating here is the, if not substitution, the ubiquitous nature of virtual interaction and virtual life. Today, our life, once upon a time, our life was enriched and our life was supplemented by virtual life. Today, it looks like it is virtually replacing our lives, our real life. It did so during the COVID lockdown. So, in the light of that, the topic assumes a lot of importance. I asked Sir which topic shall I speak on. I suggested, and Sir chose this one, and I think it's a very good choice. But I don't know how far we can go. I think I have about 40 minutes or 35 minutes for interaction, and then we have question answers. So I'm focusing on free speech dimension with special reference to hate speech, and how the law is looking at it nationally and internationally as an overview. I have had my student working fully on constitutional dimension. So some of the snippets of her deep research, including an empirical research, the doctrinal research, and some of the interactions we have had with the Cyber Law University of Pavanduggal, where we presented 6 different nation perspectives on free speech dimension. And then we have had some other experience as well in terms of recent phenomena in the particular context of people on the move. You know, people on the move includes internally displaced people, migrants. So how did online, or how did free speech, uh, I would use the word, correlate to this phenomenon, if not causing this phenomenon? So that is what I'm going to share with you, particularly from the methodology point of view. What kind of methodology we are using when we are doing legal research? To what extent is it very important to bring in the dimensions of social science research with the scientific outlook? In fact, my speech should have come after Professor Subbarao's speech, because then you would have appreciated it better in terms of the techniques and the scientific dimension that we are using. So this is in one way research about science. This is in another way, it is research about communication. It is research about technology. It is research about human behavior. It is research about the newly emerging right to life. Because Supreme Court has time and again said that with right to internet is part of right to life. So providing internet becomes primary obligation, and with the COVID, it couldn't be overemphasized, you know. So let's go to the next slide. Uh, next slide, please. This is my CV, which has already been read. Let's go to the next slide. So in the next slide, I'm going to give you a little food for thought. The one who, it is said, the one who controls the narrative, or the way in which we define or describe our reality, controls the mind and becomes very powerful. That's what we see today. I'll show you with my facts and figures how such control is existing. I think this is something dear to everybody's heart, among the majority of the audience, the social networking, the social media. I think even we, Professor Subramania and myself also, are at a level where we could not imagine our lives without social media now. I'll show you the statistics as well, the way we use the word, the supersonic way in which it has grown, the popularity, the usage, So today, there was a time, if you look at the evolution of democracy, or you look at our kattas, which became the ooms for panchayat. Today, politicking happens uh, in a kind of new type of public square. Earlier we had public square. That's how Greece evolved, democracy evolved in Greece, then the Romans followed. Today, the public square is digital. So its power and influence cannot be ignored. It's day by day, it's consolidating its power. Today, Facebook has the number of followers which exceeds one of the important religions in the world. So you can imagine how it is substituting the meaning making process in life. That's why I said control the narrative, control minds, become powerful, control life. That's happening. Therefore, we as law researchers cannot ignore the power of social media. And there hasn't been, I'll show you with literature how there are numerous research gaps which are crying for attention, crying to be researched. That's why I think it is very important to hammer this idea in this audience. There was a very important development that happened. There was one of the publications on Twitter which talked about a magazine whose celebration was there, and that celebration was about denying the Holocaust, and it also referred to Declaration of Independence as providing independence to Indian savages. Now look at the kind of suggestive meaning in this. Holocaust denial is like supporting the racism. Referring to indigenous people of US as Indian savages is spreading ethnic hatred. So when this was confronted, the Twitter CEO, first of all, said that a corporate is not like a government. It has got no power to regulate speech. Now, as far as Zuckerberg was concerned, you know who he is, founder and CEO of Facebook, he said that you cannot look at cultural uniformity. There is cultural diversity. And we are located in California. We could not control anybody's expression because each one's expression and cultural ethos is different. How do you look at it as researchers and as lawyers? Do you see it as irresponsible approach of a profiteering logic? I leave it to your thinking process. Now, there was also another phenomenon which emerged by about 2019, which was carrying an offensive video, YouTube video about Thai King. And recently there was a news about how spreading any kind of hate message about Thai King resulted in imprisonment. And most recent phenomenon is the White House siege. And they say that White House siege was indirectly fueled by Facebook, by its liberal attitude. And then they had to forcefully block Facebook posts. So now attorneys are planning thousands of cases against Facebook. Now, in India, we have had a lot of bad experience. One of the worst experiences that we went through was in 2014, the lynching of a tech guy that happened in the streets of Pune pursuant to a Facebook post. Second we had was prosecution experience of a college student writing some post about a prominent political leader resulting in their imprisonment, and courts showed a broad shoulder and released them. So online hate speech or expression of hatred, wrong information. I omitted one, fake news sometimes. Fake news where some part of the information is hybridized with some part of the information using technology and then it is passed off. Now there are very sophisticated softwares which come out with results about whether this is original media cutting or somebody has superimposed it. We have disinformation as well, where real information is selectively withheld and fake information is passed off to pass off an agenda, to serve an agenda, maybe political. And then we have this idea of right to be forgotten. Right to be forgotten came as a further extension of data privacy, and it is one's own right not to be mentioned or to withdraw the post especially it came in the context of Google forever keeping the information out there without verification and beaming it. And if I am Googling you, where your good and bad information both come, true and false information both come. And if you want that post to be taken down, you have to make a special request. So that special request is based on this right called right to be forgotten. This became very prominent in the wake of Charlie Hebdo experience of the French. And prior to that also, French had experienced a lot of national terrorist attack and violence. And recently, you know how they experienced it. So the French were very, very particular. You know, most of the original ideas in Western philosophy, they say, evolves out of the insular environment of the French. So they began with this idea. And then I myself had given a press statement on right to be forgotten when German blast was being reminded by the media. Every year on Valentine's Day, they'll hold a microphone and they'll ask, what do you think of that German blast where one of your students got killed? I mean, we have such harrowing memories of that. Other students giving blood, and rest of the students, about 4 students had those metallic things stuck in their lungs and things like that. They struggled between life and death, but they survived. This one boy took the whole impact on his back and died. So I said, we have a right to be forgotten. We need to move on, and we don't want to be traumatized by revisiting those memories. So this is one example. The other example could be credibility of a person being challenged on something they did when they were teenagers like you. So this is where right to be forgotten is very closely bound up with the right to privacy. Then we have the question, $1 million question. Should our rights of free speech and our right to not to receive the negative speech or not to be impacting our national security, compromising our personal security, because we get out of the house, suddenly there is eruption of violence because there was a WhatsApp message being circulated or there was a Facebook message being circulated. So our own right to security is at stake. So should Silicon Valley lawyers determine, or should such damage be unaddressed? Should it go to the black hole? Or is there a time-bound duty by these platform owners or operators? Or should it only be blocked for that country or for that region? These are some of the legal questions that arise out of this social media messages or posts. So I hope I have center stage the issue. I have given you some familiar dimension. Now let's go to the size of the giant. So the next slide, please. Now the next slide introduces you to what Noam Chomsky calls these necessary illusion holders or mafia of the mind. I'm sorry to use such strong words, but this is how it would be described if we were to take those general media discourses to the social media dimension. First of all, if you look at Facebook, from 2004, which was founded by Mark Zuckerberg as fellow students of Harvard University, and then they dropped out. Today, it has 2.48 billion users, which is bigger than some of the religions in the world. WhatsApp, in 2009, it was founded, and today total users are 2 billion. The moment Zuckerberg realized WhatsApp was going farther than growing faster than, imagine 2004 to now 2.48 billion, 9 to now 2 billion. So what did he do? He has taken over WhatsApp. And today all of us are precarious about WhatsApp, and there are other operators who are ensuring security coming into being. You know that. I'm sure some of you would have moved to that platform also. Then Twitter was created in 2006, and today Twitter has nearly 974 million followers. And Instagram, I have had to manage so many disciplinary issues, conduct inquiries because of this licentious way of behaving, about Instagram. Talking about your personal issues, which have a bearing on your college peer on Instagram, with that idea that this is my freedom, online free speech. What you don't remember is your future employer, when your CV is in front of the future employer or one with whom you're seeking internship, one thing he or she will do is just Google you. and look at your social media profile, because your behavior there is now construed as an evidence of your soft skill and your personality. And then what happens? The dirty linen that you have washed in public comes back to bite you. So this is why even Instagram is also becoming very ubiquitous, because there is more interactivity, and there are possibilities of very smaller groups and close knit groups, and it is insta, it is immediate. So it also has a followership. Very quickly it's growing. Now there is one more called LinkedIn, which is more decent, which has its own very strong filters. And they say that nowadays we see employees also, but they say that this is CEO's favorite platform because they always have the choice who they can link. Of course, in others also there is choice, but in others there is allurement. I myself have been a Facebook user, and I'm studying how many marriages are broken up, how many businesses have seen the dust because of this irresponsible, unthinking behavior on the Facebook. Because Facebook says you may know, so you click, and then your spouse or your girlfriend or someone knows that this person is seen when your profile is opened by them. So now privacy settings are being cared for, but that again creates more problems. So when the internet was introduced in 1998, I had read one of the first books published by United Nations. I think it is United Nations, UNICEF, mainly looking at child pornography and things like that. They had warned then only that this will be a big shocker to the families. And today it's a shocker to the business as well. A lot of business partnerships fall through. So all these social networking systems, if they are resulting in such impact, then there will be new legal challenges for the lawyers. And for researchers, it would be interesting to see how this impact is forthcoming and how law is not fast to catch up with this, or rather law has been a protector of the interest of this power, new power which has come, rather than resulting in justice, which is actually equilibrium in power. Now we have this famous TikTok. When was TikTok created? 2012. And I think anything Chinese create seems to be very impacting, as we all had the experience of. So 800 million users from 2012 to now. And it is very apt that Government of India blocked TikTok. And for that also there was hue and cry, and there were mixed opinions. You know what we don't understand, people who are using them seem to have a neutral opinion about it. The scholarly studies around the psychological and cultural impact don't seem to be emerging as in the speed with which technology is emerging. So some of the features these virtual social networking sites or social networking have assumed and substituted the real life is in becoming a new digital public square, becoming a global network, having global impact, and democracy being converted into virtual democracy, creating social connects, therefore substituting our real social interaction, and the kind of freedom, the instant way in which it flows like a lightning, So younger generation draws a thrill out of it, older generation relives its youth. So this is how it has been impacting. Now let's go to the next slide. Now, online free speech background, if you see, first of all, I gave you those terminologies, the way in which social connectivity, and this became more powerful during social distancing that we experienced. So it became a necessary public utility. You can't deprive public utility. It became as important as medical aid, because for mental health, it became very, very conducive, because it kept you, which is very important. I mean, we never witnessed such a phenomenon in last 100 years of such strict social distancing. And our medical science awareness had gone forward as a humanity. So we knew the secret with H1N1 and many other experiences and the Spanish flu, that touch is the one which is going to be becoming more critical. So given that social distancing becoming most crucial factor in containing the virus, the social networking vis-a-vis the social distancing through this forum became a panacea for mental health. So this is how social networking sites grew. The capital grew, how the shares grew. then we had, in this kind of virtual environment, how do we apply our normal constitution? So normal constitution has regulated the interaction in a democracy. Now, how in virtual democracy it's going to be acting? How far social networking site has become the important medium? How speech and expression as freedom change their dimension? Well, who has the responsibility and how are people exercising their responsibility? What is the role of the judiciary in this context? How has judiciary balanced it? Now, social networking site as a digital public square has enabled people to form association. I still remember in early 2000, we did a research on Hindu communities, because it was soon after the Ayodhya crisis, and how online Hindu communities were consolidating, especially internationally, and that was correlated with the flow of donation to the Ayodhya first stage. And then we see new political parties like AAP emerging, and how and all the corporate activities also through social networking sites, they are thriving. Facebook is not just about communities, it is not just about friendships, it's also about people selling things, and it can make or mar. We have in Pune a forum called Pune Ladies Association, Pula, and Pula can sell things within seconds. Pula can buy things within seconds at a cheaper rate, and Pula can get you proposals. Pula can challenge something and kill its, or rather weaken its reputation within no time. How do these communities filter the information? What is their responsibility? Today, that responsibility doesn't get structurally addressed by our legal system. Now we have here this right to association. That is why we are looking at it. Although there is a freedom of association, that is subject to security, that is subject to restriction, integrity of the nation. Now, right to privacy, for example, data sharing. Then we have through smartphones, WhatsApp, we can share photos, we can share videos. How do we look at these privacy settings? How does PDP bill, which is still in the proposal stage, bill stage, how does this address this? So these are the important legal questions. Now look at the way in which it is impacting. In 2000, social media usage or social networking site usage was 413 million, and today it is 4.57 billion. So how many folds it has increased? Almost, you can say about 10-fold increase within 20 years. So 7.79 billion people are the total population of the world. Out of them, 56% are urbanized. But if you look at the usage of social media or through mobile phone, with the smartphones, 5.15 billion people use it. That means out of the total population, it is more than urban population, more than city-based population, that social media is accessible and is being used. 66% people. And then because 56 are only in cities, that means other 10% people come from shanty towns and other cities, other village and other suburbs. Internet users are 4.57 billion. So those who pay and who have a direct subscription to internet, we can say that those who use phone as well as personal computer. And then we have active social media users among these as 3.96 billion. So those who access are one, active are another. So the penetration is 51%. So what is touching and being used by half of the population of this humanity and the globe doesn't seem to have been met with that extent of research from the academic community. So that is where our role comes in. They say that earlier the definition, like Aristotle said, man is a social animal. Today they say human being is a particularly, they keep the tag man, but we can say man and woman as a social networking animal. That is a new concept that is emerging. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, online freedom of speech and expression is not always positive. There have been negative online freedom of speech and expression usage, and the impact has been, or rather such usage has been in the form of hate speech And hate speech could be hatred about the gender, it could be the religion, it could be the race. Now, gender, not only women and girl children being the target of this due to prejudices, etc. There are complex issues of caste and gender as far as India is concerned, and um, uh, our transsexual community, which is being the target here. As far as religion is concerned, usually minority religion have been in the target, and even within the majority religion, those who are radicals could be target. And race, already how in the US also it was very, very visible. Now, as far as hate crimes are, and in the US, all of a sudden Amazon became very concerned about the black people. So how in business discourse also they incorporate this kind of uh, anti-establishment stir, whether it is genuine or whether it is making use of it again to campaign, controlling the narrative. Coming to hate crimes, we have criminal offense causing harm, and offender, intending offender, causing such hate crime. We have had instances of this resulting in mob lynching, resulting in riots. Earlier we had this happening through newspapers. Today it is happening through social media, and it is faster now. Now, extremism. Sometimes the communication used in social media in the personal site or in groups could be looking at discriminating. They could be political religion expression of hatred. They could influence the violence. Then we have another dimension of negative speech called fake news. I told you already. For the propaganda, they would have false and fake news. They would generate news. They would use one part, the true part, and then they would paste it and pass it off. Disseminating misinformation. I mean, during COVID crisis, so much of misinformation was on the go. WhatsApp was circulating all kinds of things which were not medically approved. And there was an attempt by some people who never had, they were not an organized group, but they simply wanted to take a kind of sadistic pleasure out of spreading such rumors, spreading such news. There is a category of people who enjoy such pleasure. So then we had a very interesting dimension of terrorism being propagated through social media, hacking, stalking, identity theft, and malicious softwares coming in, cyber terrorism. It could be simple or it could be advanced. So for example, hacking your cyber network today. Imagine hacking the cyber network of electricity board. It could send the whole city into a kind of blackout, and it could hamper hospital functions, which could cause deaths. It could hamper your that's why all these systems now have their backup solar or other backup. Imagine, I mean, I heard from US friend of mine that they have something called ransom insurance, and that is about uh, indemnifying the organization in case someone hacks the cyber network and thereby makes the financial operation impossible for some time. Or the one who hacks asks for a ransom. I will release, I will not indulge in this again if you pay me such and such a money. This is called ransom, holding at ransom. So to pay the ransom, there is a new category of insurance that organizations indulge in, and that's a huge premium because the worth of the organization, the turnover of the organization are factored into the premium of the insurance. So the consequence of this kind of hate speech is not only physical and psychological, it's economic as well. And it is social, cultural, national in terms of security. So just imagine fiddling with these little gadgets and then using your prowess to type a message or to interact and to pass on some information. What a huge devastating effect it can cause. You don't need an atom bomb to cause that devastation. Therefore, we need to research more and more on this and to see who can be held liable, how do we prevent, how do we make them accountable. Because today they are saying, I am just having this device, I have created this platform, you are the one who has used, so it is your responsibility. and you are vulnerable, it is your responsibility not to be vulnerable. Can you be that irresponsible? Can we let that go in a civilized society? And you are not simply the one who is providing a platform to do good to me. You are doing it to profit yourself, to consolidate your control. So aren't you supposed to compensate me for the harm that I have encountered in my innocence or ignorance? So these are the deeper jurisprudential questions which we need to develop as law researchers. Let's go ahead. Go ahead, please. Now, there are a lot of complexities that we have. We have legal complexities and administrative complexities. What are the legal complexities? Constitutional protection for online speech is there because Constitution says freedom of speech and expression. It doesn't exclude online speech. It is embedded within that because as technology advances, different modes of expressions come in. It is embedded within the idea of freedom of speech and expression. Statutory provisions are inadequate because they're not as fast as the development of the technology. There are lack of judicial guidelines. Judges are, as such, our judges are very liberal. They are more as a custodians of the Constitution. So they would look at the fundamental freedoms being protected, and they would not look at anything which is outside of the statute, because judicial legislation is a strict no in a constitutional scheme, although sometimes judges are given interpretative lawmaking. So there is a lot of limitation as such. Now, the Constitution acts as a very good escape clause for those who are maintaining these platforms and for those who defend such hate speech as part of their freedom of speech and expression. So there may be a need for unilateral regulation by the respective government, and there is a need for multinational regulation by both government as well as the platforms. Now for platforms, the pressure has to come from elsewhere. I'm going to discuss that. Now, second challenge is the administrative complexity. In administrative complexity, we have the jurisdictional challenge because the uploading of the post might have happened in India or it might have happened in Bangalore, and the consequence may be tremors may be felt in the whole of the country. There may be lack of procedural guidelines. There are the policing is difficult because of the unregulated nature, because the very technology is such that it is accessible not by one device, the platform, and the location also can be different. And the person who is in the location may not be the generator of the message. The intent might be somewhere else. So if we are applying our general definition of crime with the idea of actus reus and mens rea, and this actus reus being a chain of activities, and the consequences are not just going to be because you are just using a device, but the consequences can have so much of harmful effect. So is criminal law alone able to contain this? Is criminal law good enough to contain this? Because the one who is acting may not be human actor anymore. Now artificial intelligence is also coming into being. So policing becomes difficult. Constitutional guarantee becomes an escape clause. Every time and again you assert that, and thereafter the judiciary will not be able to talk much because Constitution is the mother document, sacrosanct right, and this freedom of speech and expression is embedded and interlinked with the right to life as well. Now comes the question, how constitutional supremacy has stood as a kind of large, strong protector to such behaviors is very evident in Yahoo Inc. Case, where multiple jurisdictions were involved in this kind of hate communication. Therefore, it fully went unregulated. Then multilateral regulation, like we have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, whether that could be one effective way of dealing with this. Then a lot of things come because of the protocol on the regulation of hate crime in cyberspace may be there, but then it has to have the cooperation of many countries who are affected by such hate speech or where this hate speech could be generated. So countries do not agree to accept the supervision of an external body on their constitutional guarantee of speech and expression. So that's the reality that we are facing, the transnational nature, the extraterritorial nature, rejection of an outside the country body to monitor such content. So let's go ahead. I'm just touching upon the superficial issues within the limited time. We have a very in-depth research by Dr. Surya Kulatur. And then I also developed a little bit on other aspects which came recently. Now, we know that right to freedom of speech and expression is there in the Constitution. How does it? These are the dimensions, the constitutional dimension and the law dimension beyond the Constitution. Um, uh, how do we regulate for a safe, secure state in the democracy, this kind of social or virtual democracy through social networking? Second, how do we prove the cause and effect relationship of internet governance in terms of constitutional dimension? And what can be the jurisprudential dimension? Now, you know that in China, Google is out. In Europe, Google was foisted with the suits. In India, we have never fiddled with the internet freedom. But then time and again, we block certain social networking sites. So each country has got, depending on its constitutional tradition, different approach to govern the internet and digital governance. So how do we look at the restriction of the freedom? In what way? Should it be one agency restricting it like the government? Government cannot, because government is powerless once it crosses the border. So could you give it to the individuals if individuals were aware of the law and limits of their freedom? Such instances wouldn't have come about. Of course, we don't rule out the awareness dimension. That is a long-term agenda, but immediately how do you address? That is where law comes in. So how do we develop such regulations? How do we look at regulations and concepts? Then we have in India a number of other legislations as well, like the Information Technology Act has given, rather courts have broadly interpreted section 66A. And then in 2011 and 18, the act was substituted with certain rules and regulations with the experience that globally and in India we have had with the platform being indifferent to the content because there is no censorship or anything or regulation. Then we had in the wake of Puttaswamy case, the Aadhaar case, and also in the wake of European General Data Protection Regulation, the development that came in India, the Data Privacy Bill. Now, 2019, this bill was revised, so the bill takes care of, or at least it addresses, so also these rules address the intermediary liability. The intermediary means the platform provider also is responsible to regulate. So today, like pandemic, we have infodemic. So unregulated infodemic in the wake of pandemic resulted in certain unwarranted consequences. The way in which Tablighi Jamaat was blamed solely for all the spread of COVID. Is it, I mean, whether they were aware that they could be passive carriers, that knowledge came later on from the WHO. Secondly, whether they were screened. And thirdly, when they were let out of their conference, whether there was sufficient regulation by the respective state governments. Doesn't it point to our poorer regulation of coordination between states and state and central government rather than solely squarely blaming one particular community and inciting such feelings, and more than inciting, I would use the word embellishing such feelings, gratifying such hate attitude is something that we saw during that period. Now, digital democracy, digital public sphere, as I told you already, how do we remain protective and mindful of this while maintaining the law and order is an issue. Now, I have given you the, sorry. I have given you the framework of different laws: right to privacy and personal data, Article 21, right to safe virtual space against abuse and breach, right to personal identity in the virtual world. These two are not directly addressed by the Constitution, but these are the interpretations which have come from other country jurisdictions. Right to education and awareness or social media literacy, that comes under right to education. Why should we, I mean, time has come for us not to restrict right to education only to read and write in the four walls of the school, within the four walls of the school. We have to look at it beyond that, and pen and paper kind of thing. So they're providing of internet facility to the schools, making it available, spending fee money for ensuring that, plus using that medium for education, and right to virtual life, not just life, virtual life. So we need to see how, when this sits with the constitution, existing constitutional provisions feel a tremor. They need to be stretching themselves. So this is how legal issues emerge. And there is a new obligation that United Nations has been harping on in the COVID situation, and that is the right of the state to protect the possible targets of hate speech, such as minorities, gender, and race, the protection from risks. States' duty is to protect them from risk, to ensure that they don't become the target or victims of hate speech, racism, or racial attacks, or other kinds of usage of freedom of speech and expression. What we said, the negative usage. Let's go to the next slide. Quickly now, these are the dimensions which I have already highlighted, but I would like you to look at Article 19.2 in the bottom green shapes. One is security of the state, friendly relation with foreign state, public order, decency and morality. We have even looked at Hicklin test, contempt of court, defamation, incitement to offense, sovereignty and integrity of India. Today, some of these may need to be expanded into separate legislation, especially decency and morality. Decency in communication is a legislation in some of the jurisdictions. So do we go further in this and see that we have a legislation to that effect? Or do we somehow say that decency and morality in online communication? So what kind of constitutional stretching needs to be done to incorporate this virtual life is the question that we ask here. Let's go forward. I think we have to be a little bit quicker now. Quickly, please. Now, what can be the different laws, and are they adequate, are they efficient, and are they constitutionally valid? So technology laws, I have already told you, the two sets of amendments in 2011 and 19, and the PDP bill. So there are judicial responses, different challenges. I won't expand on that, but on the right-hand side, you will see the legislations. On the left-hand side, regarding hate speech, we have got the Information Technology Act regulating the hate speech in section 66A. Although it is struck down by Constitution as far as freedom is concerned, without necessarily saying hate speech is allowed, but it says freedom. It assumes that you are exercising the freedom within the constitutional framework of respecting 19.2. It's not unfettered freedom, it's freedom with responsibility. Then section 69. Then in Indian Penal Code, we have 153A, not to incite assembly or unlawful association and reaction. 295A, that is obscenity. And then 505, which is about intimidation and other kinds of criminal behaviors. Let's go to the next one. Some of the issues and challenges faced by social networking users, then by the agencies and investigating officers, and legal responsibility of social networking users, and then legal liability of social networking sites. So these four dimensions, if you see, in terms of social networking users, there is absolute callous attitude. They are not aware of the impact, and then even the legal dimensions and the justice dimensions. They are not aware of constitutional guarantees, the privacy issues, how illegal content cannot be uploaded, illiteracy and legal remedies. They are not aware. So awareness is the first thing. Inadequate legal provision is another issue that enforcement agencies face. if it is person centric. If the officer is very much aware and are concerned, then they may hammer. And they may call an expert. If, a lot of these officers come from engineering background, they may not have any legal background. Their orientation in the police training sometimes may be taken seriously. They may not be taken seriously because there is no guideline, there is no rule. There is a need for political and public action to be taken. Some may have technical difficulty as well. So there's a need for a special training in this matter. Now, Section 79 of the IT Act, which is amended to include intermediary liability, is a way in which we are making legal liability and responsibility of social networking site. And constitutional protection and restriction is something on which IT Act is silent. Although it doesn't give any immunity or it doesn't shield, there needs to be a very explicit way of looking at it. So one of the main challenges is that understanding of privacy and freedom of speech and expression not as absolute right, and many a times the violation of age limit by falsely representing themselves and getting into these social networking sites, and then threat to national and international security, leading to crimes which are riots. For example, entire Rohingya massacre, if you see how many, 70,000 Rohingyas were massacred just because of the social media post which went viral. There can be sedition, there can be defamation. Then social media accusation and political propaganda happens. We have seen now in the American context. We have access to private information. I mean, if I mind, I can get every information about every person to some extent, as long as they are on Google or on Facebook. So there is nothing like right to be left alone. You know, privacy is that right to be left alone, and you are always under the constant vigilance of somebody or the other. Even the state can be, without your knowledge, surveilling you. So that is one. And then there is lack of awareness. Therefore, media literacy now needs to be more in social media literacy. Let's go to the next slide. Now I'm bringing you to, after discussing all these important issues, quickly, next slide, please. I'm showing you how much of literature is there. Look at the literature which has come from other countries. 2020, biggest lie on the internet, ignoring privacy policies by social networking services. Then Indian one on surveillance, he's talking about data hoarding in the data hoarding context, Desai in 2014. Then Panda et al. In 2020, they talked about social media and democracy in Indian context on the International Conference on Information and Communication Technology and Development. So from the legal field, the kind of research that is coming elsewhere, if you see, society and internet, how networks are changing our lives. So more on the communication dimension, litigating data sovereignty, Yale University Journal. So if you look at the research, I'm going to leave this presentation with you. Please go through these researchers, cybercrime investigating, how that cybercrime is also taking evidences from the social media, the tracking the footsteps and evidences. The very law about the free expression, censorship. So there are so many other corollary kind of dimensions which are sitting in public law, criminal, like constitution and criminal law, compensatory dimension of civil law. Then we have the special laws in relation to information technology. So all these different literature show you that in India, this kind of research needs to develop more, because we are a nascent community with the large percentage of young people who unthinkingly use this for the gratification and pleasure of that. So we as law researchers need to watch it from a different point of view. Let's go ahead. I have given you 2 pages full of literature, and you will be, see, digital architecture as crime control, or right to free internet, internet access and social rights. Now we are telling, is internet access constitutional right? It is bound up with right to life, with the youth, as per the recent judgments coming up. So you will see how many dimensions are coming. Let's go to the next one. And social media usage by the internee, social media usage by employee, and the impact. There could be so many dimensions. So in India, feasibility of social networking sites and the right in that hasn't been done very much, this kind of study. And addressing constitutional dimension kind of sites are also not very many. Constitutional challenges in social networking sites also, researchers have been done abroad, not much in India. On data privacy, things are just coming up. There are many regulatory gaps. And how far we are closer or farther than international developments is also an important dimension. So one study that we commissioned was on constitutionality, but you can even look at its other dimensions like right to be forgotten or hate speech. Exclusive you can look at. Let's go ahead. So as I began with this note that it is an interdisciplinary area. Now, many of the nations have advanced in regulating these areas. If you look at United States of America, we have legislation on computer fraud, electronic communication privacy, identity theft, Digital Copyright Act, Communications Decency Act. This is
सबर नहीं है क्या जय? सबर नहीं है, कारण तो बच्चा देख कर सबर नहीं दिख रहा है.
I think the moderator can mute them. Now, Communications Decency Act is where I invite your attention. It is very important for regulating hate speech or preventing hate speech. Then you look at UK. We have specific legislation on communications and Malicious Communication Act. If you come to Australia, they are talking about Privacy Act, Telecommunication Act, and many other different kinds. Even on health records, there is a very strong act. Let's go to the next slide. You will be seeing how in many other jurisdictions also there are developments. Next slide. Yeah. Now all these come from, we have General Assembly's resolution, which later on became as an alternative to Budapest Convention on Cybercrime regarding sharing of data. And right to be forgotten was highlighted by Europe's data privacy regulation. I gave you the example. And then transnational collaboration was looked at. So you see on privacy protection, there are many legislations, including child protection and data protection. On free speech, we have United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Human Rights Act of various countries, and US Constitution's First Amendment protecting right to freedom of speech, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in Australia also this right is protected. Let's go ahead. So what is the way forward for India quickly as a legal awareness if we are looking at? We have many lessons to be learned to prevent hate speech, fake news. We have Malaysia directly addressing, because they learned from the Rohingya experience as well, Anti-Fake News Act. Italy is criminalizing and introducing rules on this. Regulation on this also goes to France, where they amended the constitution to give the statute effect. We have in Germany also the legislation for net users, the word there, Netzwerk. Those who are using the internet, they will be regulated, and internet per se will be regulated. So extreme surveillance by these, automated censorship, and then surveillance on the social networking sites, automated censorship being brought in because certain words being eliminated. We had in WhatsApp more than 5 words you cannot communicate. Abridging, in seeing that, it doesn't abridge the essence of democracy. So we have had cases also, and then judiciary has been a very good barometer of balancing hate speech with free speech. Let's go ahead. Now, if you look at the international legal framework, I'll throw a little light on how do they propose to regulate these social networking site managing companies. United Nations framework clearly says, on the one side, we have the human rights law, which is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19 and Article 20, which looks at protection of free speech and regulating it in the interest of security of the state or national importance. Now, United Nations Guiding Principles by John Ruggie, the Harvard professor, called Business and Human Rights Guiding Principles, levy responsibility on transnational corporations to not to violate human rights. We also have different regimes of national law, as we saw. So here, misinformation, disinformation can be regulated by a code, content code generated by themselves, by the social networking companies or their philosophy. But if you leave it to the companies, the problem is which philosophy? How do those philosophies or codes conform to international concerns and accepted guidelines? Because all the nations are privy to UNGA, that is General Assembly Resolution, etc. So when you look at their code, the content code that Twitter published, it was informed by United Nations Human Rights Convention, and then, European Communities Human Rights Convention, European Convention on Human Rights, and General Assembly's guiding principle. So, although European Convention on Human Rights talks about in the line of United Nations principle, what about European Union, which had banned a blasphemous film made by a Turkish director? So are they absolutely for free speech? How do they decide the restriction on the free speech? Are they motivated by political dimension rather than legal dimension? So there is an author whose article I have given as a reference to you in my last slide, who questions this. So on the site, it is private actors. Those who are regulating are private transnational corporations. Can we have a parallel government policy regulating the content? What is the stand of the government policy? But because governments have a stronger hold to block the access at the national level. How do we balance? Bonavero Human Rights Institute of Oxford has said during COVID that it becomes government's responsibility and duty not to allow harmful, risky communication through online medium, which may result in hate or which may result in harm during COVID, in labeling certain community or stigmatizing. So in the light of this, let's go to the next slide. How do we make these platform providers like Google or Facebook or Twitter becoming responsible? If you go back to the history also, it's very clear that United States of America was the one which did not want any kind of restriction because it went by its First Amendment philosophy. But then it was Russia which was very particular on putting that Article 20 to ban any kind of advocacy of hatred, inciting violence or discrimination. Can you see that? And look at the period. ICCPR was developed in 1966. So, that was a time of the Cold War between US and Russia. And the US was using propaganda model against communism and against communism supported nations. So for them, looking at such a ban was very important at that time, not to rule the mind. However, in 2003 onwards, there has been a kind of new thinking process because of the nature of globalization going into Asian countries, etc., and the power of these corporations. So they started this guiding principles on human rights. You know the reason. Nike factory in Vietnam will pay peanuts. There will be 50,000 people. So much profit the company will make, but they will not pay even $2 wage per day. So such inhuman experiences made them to come out with these guiding principles on business and human rights and making these companies to be answerable. Now, being mindful of this, the global network initiative started by all transnational companies. And they said that any kind of regulation by the local government should pass through the tripartite test. One is it by law? Have they promulgated a law? Have they declared that law? Secondly, is it absolutely necessary? What kind of development which is harmful has caused this law to come? Third, is there any objection to such law in public interest? Then we are not bound by that law. If any of the national restriction on such transnational corporations, including social networking companies, are not passing these three tests, for example, in China, they have passed a law. They have restricted access to Google. Now, it is provided by law in the Chinese sense of law. And it is necessary in China because China feels that there is social disturbance. And then is there any objection? The nature of state in China does not publicize the objection and does not let the objection. So any kind of vague law, if it is restricting the operation of these companies, sitting in California, they will spend millions on lawyers and they say that we will be going to defend through lawsuit. That's why in the beginning itself, we said that in California, a bunch of lawyers will sit and they will determine what kind of content is harmful content and where the content is justified, or when do we withdraw. It takes long time to block such content. By that time, the harm would have been done. So the justification these companies give is that law is vague, improperly promulgated, it is least intrusive, and our communication is least intrusive, and this law should also justify that it is not taking away the freedom, it is only blocking the content. So the form of reaction from the state also should be in phase-wise manner, first giving a notice and then blocking a content. So state doesn't do directly, it makes the company to do it. Means Facebook will tell to the user. That would be the ideal state. So either you deplatform, that is the last resort. But before that, other action should be taken. And then give the option of right to be forgotten by bringing down the post. And they also thought that if they continue like this, their own share value will go down, it will have market impact. However, what we see is that the kind of Eurocentric bias, as we see in international law anyway, is also seen in the kind of code or content code that autonomously these social networking companies adopt. They will not look at human rights regulation of ASEAN or Cairo Declaration, which looks at protecting Islamic principles, but they would rather look at European Convention on Human Rights. So this is one thing that has been criticized by scholars. Let's go to the next one. This is going to be my last slide, where I'm talking about should the companies which are operating social networking sites or devices, should they be giving their own speech code on content moderation, then so that it is filtering hate speech and fake news, etc. Is it their responsibility by steps such as blocking, deleting, warning, and blocking the account or deplatforming if that content is misinforming, radicalizing, hating, or intrusive? Or should the government control it? Should they change the content based on national laws or regulation based on national laws in terms of content code? So we know that as recently as last November, United Nations has taken an initiative on online hate speech against minorities phenomenon. And it said that there should be a concerted action, there should be a separate guiding principle. In addition to the John Draghi principle, which puts onus on the corporation, it should put onus both on corporation and governments. So what should we do with our law now? It should be finally balancing hate speech and free speech by co-regulating with the companies. There should be a national regulation as well, but it should sit with the international law principles, and the companies should be made to follow as well. So my last message to you is some of the questions that I've raised in the background of such an extensive, excellent research by Dr. Surya, as well as some of my own research brought in. I challenge you to develop a research idea in the current context, examine the technology, examine the Facebook post or Twitter post, series of posts. You can do it thematically, or you can do in the period wise, like during the COVID. You can take one particular subject, such as a migrant, or such as medical information, such as quarantine guidelines, or international travel restrictions. You can, or in your own society, how the society Adda or society's own Facebook or social media, WhatsApps communicated the message, and then juxtapose them against the rules and regulations of free speech and our existing regulations from the Information Technology Act, and then you draw your conclusions, superimpose them with international development. So define your research, define the phenomenon, look at the laws, define your design, and look at publication. Now, my last challenge to you is, should we amend Article 19.1 by saying that right to freedom of speech and expression should include these lines, and restriction should include these things? Should we explicitly add hate speech there? Is there a need to do that? So these are some of the questions I'll comfortably leave with you. Now I'll just be in the last slide where I'm thanking the key researchers, which is Dr. Surya and Dr. Raj for supporting with one article, which is by Evelyn Mari. This is the article which does an extensive case study published in 2019 on the hate speech aspect in Twitter and Facebook, especially the case study on the so-called Indian savages, and then some of these other dimensions which have come. So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Subramania, for this wonderful opportunity. And I will again miss your warm hospitality. But it's very forward-looking of you to accommodate this topic among all the topics I suggested. Congratulations on that. And we expect from Silicon City, Bangalore, there will be many critical researchers emerging in the legal and policy and regulatory area on these dimensions and questions I have raised. Thank you.
Participants, if you have any question, kindly drop the questions in the chat box.
How many of you will take up legal research in relation to social media? How many of you will stop using social media? You can't, nobody can.
I will.
But how many of you will get literacy on that? And you know, the new concept that we are developing as part of 21st century skills is digital literacy. It is called digital quotient actually. Like how you have EQ, emotional quotient, intelligence quotient as IQ, the new phenomenon is digital quotient. OECD and a few other bodies are strongly going into this, in which we have dimensions such as digital literacy, dimensions of using digital data as part of the curriculum, part of the decision making. So in future, this is going to be very important for all of us. Right now only its importance cannot be ignored. Therefore, I suggest all of you do incorporate digital world related dimensions into your assignments, into your research. Like for example, when you are looking at contracts, you are looking at e-contracts. You can look at online contracts, like procurement. If you're studying, then online procurement, because everything is getting based on internet or regulated or facilitated by internet. So internet of things, and here the word things can be internet of law or the law of internet of things, you know. It's too complicated. It takes a while to understand and it takes a while to assimilate also, because I have raised a large number of issues with the data that we brought to the table. But I only want your response in terms of, I hope all of you have understood. It has not gone above your head.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Please.
So, do you think that since the central government cannot have a legislation or does not have a legislation to regulate social media manipulative messages or like false messages,
Yeah.
the state government should be given that power to regulate?
Actually, law and order is already under the power of the state government. State government has got in policy and regulation, cyber cell, cyber crime prevention cell, prevention and regulation cell. So definitely that power is there in the state government within the generic law and order. What we need is a more carefully defined policy in consonance with the international regulations like Budapest Convention, etc., and also this UNGA principle, because internet is not national or not state. It is transnational. Regulators are sitting somewhere else. That is why it will strengthen. I agree with you that state measures are going to make it very effective. But how do they make it effective? To what extent? That needs to be informed by proper sense of law, because they themselves are users. They are subjective in their approach as well.
Do we have any questions?
Like, you know, in a state where cyber cell is well developed, equipped with highly qualified people, depending on the leadership of the DGP and awareness of the DGP, sometimes how they reallocate their manpower, we have seen very effective busting of online rackets. We see a world of difference between the way in which it is handled in one state and another state. This discrepancy comes because we don't have a very structured regulation and standard operating procedure. That is where, and guideline, that is where we are arguing that our concept has to be very clear jurisprudentially, and it has to take care of all the three arms of the state: executive, uh, legislature. Once legislature is very clear and legislation is very clear, executive and judiciary will be very clearly guided, and there will be consistency.
So much, ma'am, for that insightful session.
Thank you. Thank you, CMR team and Professor Subramanian sir. Thank you very much. It's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.